Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we have a Wernog Elmar Partner 4-color Commander deck. This deck comes to us from Most Likely Not a Robot, who only says, still working out the kinks. Let's see what these kinks are and if we can help them get worked out. As always, the deck list for this video is in the description below, and I highly recommend you come take a look at this deck. This is a very, very complicated deck with a lot of different moving parts that are trying to do a lot of different things. So any assistance you can provide me with suggestions would be incredibly helpful. This is a fun deck, and I would like to improve it. So, who are our commanders and why are we using them? Now, I'm a little familiar with this because I played a version of this deck that is Mardu using Wernog. So let's start with Wernog and let's see what Elmar adds to it. Wernog is a 1/2 2-mana human that when it enters the battlefield, it and leaves the battlefield, sorry, you get a very specific trigger. So you get I'm going to read this not as the card says, just to make it a little easier. So you get a clue. Then each opponent decides whether or not they get a clue. And for each clue that they say that they get, you also get a clue. For each opponent who doesn't pick up a clue, they lose 1 life. So the dream scenario is everyone says yes to the clue, you get 4 clues. And then the more likely scenario is everyone says no, they each lose 1 life, and you get 1 clue. Now, this is on enter the battlefield or leave the battlefield, so flicker effects, as this deck uses, are incredibly useful for Wernog. Then we have Elmar, and Elmar is a hasty 3/2 for 3 in red and green, and they say whenever you cast your second spell, you untap a creature and then you investigate, as in you get a clue. So the general idea of using these kind of commanders is you want to get as many clues as possible and benefit from doing things you already want to do. Wernog entering the battlefield or dying or being blinked or being exiled all trigger him in order to get more clues. Elmar just benefits you for every second spell you cast, which is something this deck can definitely do. If we look at the curve, the deck's curve is pretty normal. Goes up to 3 and then starts coming down. We have 2 7-mana cards with Hellkite Igniter and Ruinous Ultimatum, with Hellkite Igniter probably being a 9-mana spell because you want to be able to use that ability on attack, and it has haste. We might get back to it. I'm not a very big fan of Hellkite Igniter here, and Ruinous Ultimatum I always have some problems with. But before we get any further, I think the most visible thing of the deck, beyond going through card by card, which is very difficult in a deck like this, is understanding the more general points of the deck and where we can kind of see what to change and what to improve. There are so many moving parts in this deck. Each card and a lot of these legendaries interact with different aspects of the combo, or let's say of the commanders, right? You either are using things to improve your tokens and get more use out of them, using cards to blink Wernog and get more effects. You're using cards that benefit from the tokens that are already out. Actually, that's the same thing as Friend of the Forest. And you've got cards that, work as blink effects themselves. So there's a lot happening. So instead of rushing into this and going card by card, let's look at like I said, the general things and see if there's ideas that we can start picking apart there. Well, the first thing I note is that this deck has really, really intensive color requirements, right? You need really, really specific requirements. For example, if you're just playing the commanders as written, you need a white and a black on turn 2 and at least a green on a red on turn 3. I'm not going to say that's impossible. I'm just going to say that's a little difficult. We can see that we are playing less fetch lands than I would hope. And Prismatic Vista only gets basics. So Marsh Flats seems to be the only fetch land Fable Passage as well, I'm going to put with Prismatic. So Marsh Flats is one of the only real fetch lands that we have in the deck. Now, I know for a lot of people it's a little uninteresting to start with the lands and talk about them, but if this deck is going to continue to grow in a steady way, I think the first thing that might need to happen is that a consideration should be brought out for having tri-lands, which are lands that have three types, like in Datha Triome, to play as many of those as possible, and also playing the fetches that grab them. Once again, Marsh Flats is really, really good here because we can use it to grab, for example, in Datha Triome, having access to 3 of our 4 colors. That's really good. If we have more fetch lands and more tri lands, we have more cards we can get. One of the problems with a card like Jungle Shrine is that you cannot grab it with a fetch land, which is a little tricky. You also cannot grab it with cards like Farseek, which we're already playing, because it doesn't have any card types. So that is something to think about. In the meantime, we need to think about other ways we can fix up our mana and adjust for it. Well, one of the first things I'm noticing is that we aren't playing the full collection of mana rocks. Now, what makes this tricky is that in 4 colors we have a wide berth of mana rocks that we could be playing, and we need to decide to what degree we want to play mana rocks or we want to play ramp. So really briefly, I'm going to talk about that because I think it stands out as one of the key points of fixing mana in this deck. So really nicely, here's the situation. We can use artifacts or we can use green ramp. Both of these we can find generally at 2 mana at a reasonable cost to give us multiple colors at once. For example, Farseek versus Talisman of Conviction. Both of these cards can give us at least 2 colors most of the time, with Farseek grabbing, let's say, Sacred Foundry, and Talisman of Conviction tapping for either red or white. So outside of that, what is the perk? Well, the first perk is we are in a pseudo artifacts deck. So all of our artifacts have an additional benefit of being able to be used with something like Jan Jansen. Every single one of our artifacts, our talismans and signets, can be used by him to get an additional effect, right? The other benefit is that you can. Was that the only benefit? Okay, so let's say the other downside would be is then we are further all in on an artifact strategy that makes us more vulnerable to, artifact board clears, stony silence effects, and the like. The benefit, which I'm going to another benefit, which is I'm going to go into Farseek effects, is that artifacts generally do not cost colored mana, whereas these Farseek effects will require you to have green, and you're going to need your mana base to be able to produce the green early on in order to make the most of them, right? You need green as one of your first colors so you can get the rest of your colors. However, the benefit side of Farseek effects is that they are lands. You are thinning your deck by reducing the land count, and in addition, lands are generally harder to interact with. I say generally. If your friends play a lot of Blood Moon, maybe not the best idea. But most of the time, land destruction or land disruption is harder to come by than artifact destruction and disruption. So those are the two sides of the coin. On a budget, I would recommend going into the artifacts more because they are cheaper than getting a bunch of fetch lands and a bunch of triomes. And you especially need the triomes if you're going to play more Farseek effects. If budget's not a concern, I would probably recommend the Farseek effects first, and then probably keeping this collection of artifacts. The other thing on terms of mana is that I would love to see a few more treasure cards in here if possible. I think right now we have a few. Big Score stands out. That's generally it. Academy Manufacturer makes treasures through our commanders. So Treasures are really good here for two reasons. One, they fix our mana. That's good. Two, actually three reasons, I guess. Two, they're another artifact that works well with our clues, that we're just creating artifact tokens that can be used in a number of different ways. But most importantly, they can be spent on our clues. One of the things in a deck like this is we get to a point where we're just inundated with clues. We have like 8 clues, and you've got cards in your hand that you want to cast, and you don't have the mana to keep sacrificing clues to get ahead on card advantage and cast the spells you want. So any form of treasure cards would be really helpful here. In fact, the first one I'm going to suggest, Sheriff, is Lotho. And I'm going to try to avoid suggesting too many cards because your deck is already inundated with lots of complicated cards. So I'm going to try to keep that low and more attack the kind of areas that it needs to be worked on. But Lotho, I'm going to suggest right now because Lotho is a fantastic card. If you haven't gotten him, I recommend you do. He's in your colors. He's like another version of Elmar because they both trigger on the second spell, except for this is everyone's second spell. And so it's on theme. He's a legendary creature. Definitely play him. That'll start your treasure setup. And then, of course, as a more expensive thing, this is the kind of deck that would absolutely love Smothering Tithe, which I'm pretty sure you're not playing. I should double. Yeah, you only have the one enchantment. This is the kind of deck that would love Smothering Tithe, and I would absolutely recommend that here. In addition to this, any form of treasure making, Magda is good here. Dahada works really well in terms of what she does for legendaries. There's a lot of cards here that can make a lot of treasures here, and especially if you find things that make treasures on Enter the Battlefield, much like Lobella Sackville Baggins, Lobelei. I could be wrong about that. Lobelei that make treasures on ETB, so all your flicker effects work really well with that too. With a bunch of treasure, I think you will find that the deck will move forward at a quicker pace and a reasonable pace where you feel like you're drawing into cards and you're able to cast them right away. So that's a direction that I think is worth looking into. In addition, I think generally I want to say I want you to reduce some of your mana cost cards, but that's kind of tough to do. A lot of the cards you're playing because you have to be playing them. Like Sky Shroud's Claim, I don't particularly like here, but at the same time, the ramp is really, really useful. And the fact that it can get you the colors you want by getting your Shocklands or One Day Triomes is really, really good. I think a few of the things I want to say, for example, I think this deck could benefit from another card draw ability that is just consistent. Painful Truths and Read the Bones are really good here. I wouldn't mind instead of Ambition's Cost if you were playing Phyrexian Arena, because that could just be turn by turn, whereas Ambition's Cost puts a bunch of cards in your hand, but it's a bit slow. Like, once again, without having a ton of mana out, it's going to be tricky for you to be able to do something with the 3 cards you just drew. And with that in mind, I'd rather have something that is more consistent and constant that you can spend those cards on. I'm worried you're going to be in a situation where you have a ton of things to do with mana and no mana to do all of them. But those clues will just kind of hang out and not do anything. There is another version of Reckless Fireweaver, I believe, at 3 mana. I would look into that as well. Okay, so I have a few things that came to mind. I would also like to suggest, in addition to, you have a lot of legendary creatures, like a lot of legendary creatures. And so, especially with the addition of Lotho, I think if we could put something like Rudadrobic, I would be interested in that. Rudadrobic is really good in this deck because it allows your creatures to come back when they die, especially the legendaries that have ETB abilities, especially Wernog, which is really, really good. And so that can get you a little more advantage there. Another legendary matters cards is Shanid. Shanid cares when you gives your legendary creatures menace, and every time you play a legendary land or cast a legendary spell, you draw a card. You could play this instead of Phyrexian Arena because once again it is gradual card draw. I think this is fine here, just as another kind of card advantage thing. Actually, thinking about that, maybe I'm more going to suggest Guardian Project because Shannon doesn't work with flicker effects, but Guardian Project does. So perhaps think about playing Guardian Project as your card advantage engine. So as you flicker and play Wernog, you get an additional card there. And we're going to actually take a moment. Actually, let's come back to that. I'm going to say the last few suggestions as well. The last few suggestions were Delighted Halfling, which I will admit is kind of an expensive card right now, but does tap for any color for your legendary creatures, which once again you have a lot of. It's a mana dork that comes in green and therefore comes can be in the same color of your ramp, and then taps for any color for your commanders, which is really really nice. In a similar way in terms of reducing mana, Kethis, with once again kind of a restrictive casting cost, makes all your legendary spells cost one less mana to cast, which is really really nice, especially for like your 3 and 4 mana legendary creatures. And then you can exile 2 legendary creatures from your graveyard to cast legendary creatures from your graveyard. I don't know how much you're going to be using the second ability, but in a pinch, I think it's really, really good to allow you to buy back any, like, whichever is the correct legendary that you need at that moment. You can even do the thing where you let Wernog go into the graveyard, knowing that you have Kethis out to exile Wernog and put it back in the command zone, which could be really helpful to then cast another legendary. I think that's just kind of nice. And the last one, Teshar, our 4 mana Teshar, is whenever you cast a historic spell, return a creature 3 mana or less into battlefield. Your legendaries are all historics, and buying back some of your 2 and 3 mana legendaries would be real great, including Wernog. 5 mana Teshar works kind of similarly, but not great. Like, once again, whenever you cast one of your legendaries, you get to reanimate your legendary and you let it attack, or actually any permanent, now that I realize it. But you then lose it forever, which is tricky. This could be real good with things like Hellkite Igniter, Hellkite Tyrant, where these are cards, well, not Tyrant actually, because you need upkeep, but Hellkite Igniter very much so could be used here. But you could also use this as permanent, so worse, you could use it to get a command sphere and draw. But getting like Sophina out, I think it would be very good with Sophina because then you get Sophina out, you get the attack, and you get a bunch of clues immediately, which could be very, very good. You can use it to get Osgir and trigger Osgir right away. Maybe, I'd say, maybe not the best, but it is an option here, just as I remember that Teshar got Phyrexianized recently. All right, let's come back to the other thing I wanted to talk about, and most likely the thought that I'm going to kind of close up on is about Wernog and the direction of the deck. So right now, this deck feels like an archetype of death by 1,000 cuts, where you're building to gain a lot of card advantage in a very complicated way. And I like this kind of deck. I have friends who play these kind of decks. They can be really, really powerful because you feel like you can adapt to almost every situation. However, what I'm going to suggest is that we should still pick a final direction for your win condition and your winning, like your game plan to go into, right? Right now, it feels like all of the game plans are kind of going at all at the same time. You have the flicker going on that's really good with Wernog. You've got some cards that work well with artifacts, which once again can work with the flicker and Wernog. And then we have generally really good, legendary creatures that benefit from certain board states, such as Lobella, such as Jaheira. Jaheira? I think I pronounced her earlier, and I've already forgotten how to do that. And generically good cards like Eldrazi Displacer. But when it comes to winning the game, we don't have a lot of really good options. Hellkite Tyrant stands out as one of the strongest ones because it works with your Flicker theme. But beyond that, I think Corvold can put you very, very far ahead in card advantage and have a really big beater. But if either of these cards are removed, you're kind of put on the back step where you're once again kind of grinding through clues, grinding through legendaries, and trying to get enough card advantage to, I guess, win with attack damage. Reckless Fireweaver is a really great card, but if you want that, you should be playing as well the other copies of that, including the creature whose name escapes me right now, Disciple of the Vault, which works as another version of this kind of effect. Um, though, granted, I think that's more of a copy of where is it Mayhem Devil than it is anything else. Like, these are really good support spells to do damage, but they're much better when we go all in on the theme. So, with that in mind, my suggestion would be at this point to pick a direction for your final part of your game plan to go into, and then we're going to commit a little more to that direction. So, for example, if we really want the blink, we've got Hellkite Tyrant as a nice blink, we've got Sun Titan as a nice blink, and we've got Wernog as a nice blink. I wouldn't mind having a few more, right? Or things that benefit these kind of effects. So, such as we said earlier, Guardian Project, but uh, our Tokazia, I always mispronounce that. Tokazia's Welcome is another card that works really well with blinking and with Wernog, which is another card draw every time you blink Wernog. One of the reasons I'm not going to 100% suggest blink, or I'm going to put a caveat in front of it, is that blinking Wernog is actually trickier than we hope it would be. Wernog doesn't get you as much advantage by itself because there's a really high chance that at a certain point in the game, your opponents are just going to say no to the tokens, and then every blink of Warnog represents one damage to each opponent and one clue. Sorry, that's ETB. I should say every blink represents two damage to each opponent and two clues, which is great, but you need to do that a tremendously large amount of times, or have all of these cards like Reckless Fireweaver, Guardian Project, Kazia's Welcome, all of these cards that will benefit that blink to push that advantage over the edge. Something to think about. I think it's definitely doable, but I think alternatively, another option would be is to just pick some really big game-ending spells that you can at least grab, draw into, and finish the game in when you find yourself unable to win with Hellkite Tyrant or Corvold, right? I'm thinking I'm thinking even cards like Insurrection, but cards like Rise from the Dark Realms, any of those like 8 mana plus spells in your colors that give you unsurmountable advantage, I would play some collection, like one or two of those, maybe just one, honestly. Ruinous Ultimatum is one of those cards, but generally Ruinous Ultimatum gets better when you have a more threatening board, and your board itself isn't that threatening. It's a bunch of legendaries which tend to have anywhere between 3 to 2 power, and though that can add up pretty quickly, it just doesn't represent a quick finish. And Runa's Ultimatum works really well when you cast it and swing out to defeat one of your opponents. And I think maybe that's kind of not really on point. The last thing I think I want to suggest for what it's worth as another direction that I really like is Sunforger. This is something that I see that your deck could play. Sunforger, you do have to commit to it. It does become a big part of your deck, but in a 4-color deck, you have so many good red and white instants that you can go and grab, and it gives you a kind of solid base that you can lean into, which you're already playing, right? Like cards like All the Path of Exile, Swords of Plowshares, Deflecting Palm, Despark, Dire Tactics, Rakdos Charm, Let's see, Generous Gift, Mortify, Naya Charm, and Big Score and Semester End. That's like almost every one of your instants are cards that Sunforger can go grab. So if you like playing those instants and you'd like to be able to have access to them at all times, Sunforger could be a card that you should think about. It is it is a card that fits well in these kind of strategies as it doesn't take as much slots as you would think when you're already playing value in these colors, right? All you need is someone to swing the hammer. Not even swing the hammer. All you need is someone to attach the hammer to. And then up to you, you can play cards that tutor the hammer. But once you have the Sun Forger, it kind of opens up your deck to get the cards that you need to stay in the game. And I think that can be helpful. All in all, I think this deck is really, really strong. It is really difficult to build. It doesn't have a through line of synergy, and I understand why you're still refining it uh, right now because it is kind of a hard thing to find. As you say, you're still working on the kinks. Yeah, that's fair. I think the first step I would always suggest in a deck like this is to work on the mana base to ensure that you can cast all your spells on curve, so you're always, always ahead. And then after which, I would start considering maybe streamlining some of the themes to pick an end game that you know you can win and you can go to and win with, and kind of, building towards that a little more. Whether it be a mass reanimation spell, whether it be a card that grows your board incredibly quickly, such as Cathar's Crusade, or I don't know, you could even just find an infinite combo that you would like to play and play that, or leaning more into the artifacts. Whatever it is you pick, I think you will have a little more success that once you pick that, you can then just go into it. I hope this has helped. This is a fun deck. I'm really interested in seeing the next draft of it. Um, when you have the next draft or any draft of any deck, you can send it to me using the form in the video description below. I'd love to see it. And our list is pretty long. If you'd like to skip the line, there is an option there with a donation to the channel. But otherwise, I would love if you would do the YouTube thing, like, comment, subscribe as always. Um, I would love to hear people's suggestions on this deck because this is a complicated deck and it's really hard to kind of, you know, any decision I make picks a direction for the deck to be built in, and I don't want to take that away from the deck builder. I think it's up to the deck builder to pick that decision. So, with that in mind, I'd love to see another draft of this deck. I'd love to see what direction it goes into, and just generally, I love this partner combination, and I want to see where it goes. Like I said before, I used to play Sofina Wernog, and I think it's a really fun deck. And by adding a color, you've increased a lot of things you can do with it. So I'm really interested to see what happens. All right, good luck.